and welcome to another edition of All Politics is Local. I'm John Featherston, and we're joined by a special guest tonight, Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who is a retired from the University of Arkansas and an expert on anything to do with policies and standards in education. And I thought it was good to have her come back tonight. If you're fans of the program, you remember her from a couple years ago when she came on and was talking about Common Core right before the 2016 elections. She has a new book coming out this May, Changing the Course of Failure. So welcome, Dr. Stotsky. Thanks for coming back to All Politics is Local.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
It's always a pleasure. You and I met, 3, 4, 5 years ago now at a Common Core meeting that we were at. Just so the audience knows that you and I are both not big fans of Common Core. And you've got a new book coming out, Changing the Course of Failure. So let's talk a little bit about your background so we can bring the audience up to speed, and then we'll talk about your new book.
Thank you.
So, like I said, you're retired from the University of Arkansas. Let's talk a little bit about, what you did for the Department of Education, both on the state and the federal level.
I worked here in Massachusetts for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, as it is now called, and I worked from 99 to about 2003, and during that time I was in charge of developing or revising all of the K-12 standards that we had in the state. I was also in charge of revising most of the teacher licensure tests and developing criteria for professional development. Anything that had an academic component I was in charge of. I was working directly under Commissioner David Driscoll, who had hired me, and I was reporting not only to David Driscoll, who was the Commissioner of Education at that time, I was also reporting to Jim Pizer, who was chair of the State Board of Education at that time. He's now our Secretary of Education under Governor Baker. Mm-hmm. And I was in charge of, as I say, almost anything that had an academic component to it, trying to make sure that we were implementing to the best of our ability all of the teacher and student related aspects of the Massachusetts Education Reform Act, which was passed by our state legislature in 1993-94. And when I came on board in 1999, I was to revise our teacher licensure regulations and tests and to revise or develop all of our standards because that was what was mandated by MERA, as I will call it, MERA. And so we did such a good job that Massachusetts kids went to the top, and it was called the Massachusetts Education Miracle.
There you go. And a lot of hard work and a lot to be proud of.
We did.
But now you're worried about that there might be an achievement gap within the public
Well, we
school.
know that students are not overall doing as well as they did under the state standards that we had helped to develop when I was in the department. Common Core was voted in by the State Board of Education in 2010. That was when I was on the board and left the board that year, as required by a statute that Governor Patrick had made sure the legislature had written at his request. So I was no longer on the state board to ask persnickety questions about whatever was going on. And after 2010, Common Core's standards were gradually introduced. Ours that we had spent all those months developing and which had had such good results were now being phased out until 2015. We became an all Common Core state with a Common Core aligned test that is, ironically enough, called MCAS 2, or Next Generation MCAS, but it has basically almost nothing to do with the old MCAS tests, right, or the original ones, which were based on the standards I helped to develop, which had propelled all groups of kids, all demographic groups, they were all doing better because that was the goal of MIRA. We were trying to strengthen public education for all kids, not just the bottom, for all kids, and we were doing that. We were getting stronger teachers through whatever we did with licensure tests and licensure regulations, and we also had very good MCAS tests based on first-rate standards. That was why we ended up producing what was called the Massachusetts Education Miracle. I'll let you get in a question now.
No, I mean, but I just sit here and as you're talking, and I've been in local politics for a very long time. The name of the program is All Politics is Local. You know, anybody who gets involved in politics, I think, really wants to make a difference. It doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, Independent. I really think you get into it because you think you can make a difference and make a change. And I would like to think that the people who changed these standards thought that they were doing something good for everybody, but the results are there to say that they're not. So what was the motivating factor to change all of this? And in my words, lower the standards.
And that's what seems to
Is
be
it
happening
money?
when we look at our national report card tests, which come out, they're called National Assessment of Educational Progress. And the tests show that Massachusetts kids are declining overall. On average, they're not doing as well as they used to. At one time, starting from '05, Massachusetts kids were first among all states in both math and ELA, grade 4, grade 8, for 5 consecutive national tests. We had independent evidence that what we had produced here was effective. But it wasn't a question of whether they were effective. We weren't closing what everyone seemed to think was a big problem, the gaps. And the gaps, we're still not sure what they mean exactly, but it's somehow a difference in the percentage of kids from certain demographic groups compared to the percentage passing or doing well from other demographic groups, whites and Asians. I mean, that's how it's interpreted. But it seems to be percentage instead of raw numbers, because in Massachusetts, we actually have small numbers of African American students, we have growing numbers of Asian students, but the reauthorization of, I'm sorry for all of these acronyms, ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which began under LBJ as president in 1965 and has been reauthorized at different times by Congress to give money in what is known as Title I, and there are other titles that give money. All of those pieces of money were to help disadvantaged students. And the burden of my new book is to show that whatever the U.S. Department of Education has been doing since 1965 hasn't worked. The kids who were at the bottom in 1965 are still at the bottom on average. All of the different things, whether you're looking at preschool programs or different strategies used by teachers, and I list them all in my book, and I give readers the latest research reviews, overviews, summaries of the research that's available, often commissioned by foundations or the U.S. Department of Education to begin with. But it turns out that whatever we've done, all the money that has gone in, and it's been an increasing amount of money since 1965 that Congress voted and just re-voted, by the way, this past week. This was despite the effort by some people in the Trump administration to try to eliminate some of the categories in which money was being slotted for the U.S. Department of Education. But Congress didn't like that budget, which just passed this past week, and they added more money. And all of this more money is now going to ineffective programs. And you have to keep asking yourself, why do we want to fund ineffective programs when we
Right.
know they're ineffective? Would it be better to simply throw the money out a window and be done with it that way? Why do we fund? Now, what are some of the ineffective programs? Preschool programs. We've had major reviews of Head Start and other preschool programs, and while a few small ones can be located that turn out to have long-term benefits, most of them don't. Some of them actually produce negative findings for the future of the program and the kids who are in it. But the point is that the professional development, we haven't any research that shows it has value. And what the Trump administration tried to do was to get rid of the Title II money that was allotted for professional development, and Congress gave it even more money. So you end up with Congress not understanding that if you keep giving more funds to ineffective programs,
You're
not-
going to keep getting what we're getting.
you are not getting improvement. We haven't had improvement at all since 1965. Just a few little spots, but it doesn't matter by the long run, and the long run is what happens in high school with kids who are graduating or taking exit tests. We don't see the results coming from K through 8 that would show that those kids have actually benefited from the intervention programs or whatever other kinds of programs were there.
Well, let me stop you there, because I
Yeah.
think you bring up an interesting point, and you asked me a question just right before the cameras went on. I am a proud father of 2 boys who graduated from high school just this past year, and they're off to college now. Both of them are National Honor Society students. Their dad never was. Their mom and my wife was, but I never was. And and I will tell you that, proudly, that my kids are smarter than I am. But I don't think they have the basics that I had, though. Because sometimes I'll say to my kids, we'll talk about money, or and you'll see that they have to stop and think about it. I know it, and I knew it early on in school. I don't think my kids write as well, certainly not as well as my wife writes or anything like that. So here I am, a proud parent, and they're both doing very well in college, Dean's List and everything like that. But sometimes I worry that they didn't get the basics that I got. But I will tell you that they're much smarter than I am. So I can see some of the benefits of the new education system, because I think kids are more exposed now, and that might be because of social media and the web and everything. I was wondering what your take on that was.
Well, your children actually didn't have much of Common Core.
No,
Students
they did
who are
not.
in the last 5 or 6 years, Common Core has only been in the schools since 2011 and 12.
Right, so they
And
only
the
had about
first
5 years
tests
of it.
began in 2015. So it's parents of kids in the elementary and middle school who are the ones complaining the loudest.
Okay.
And this is where we don't see much progress, if any, because that's where the foundations for high school study are being laid. And if they're not being taken care of in the early grades, they're not going to show up in high school. I won't talk as much about math because that isn't my area of expertise. English language arts is. But when one looks at what is being required for reading purposes, for the literature reading curriculum, your students, your children may have benefited from a high school that had a fairly traditional or reasonable, coherent English literature curriculum,
Which they
so
didn't
that
have.
whatever they read from grade 9 to 10 to 11 and 12 increased in reading difficulty, and they became able to read college-level textbooks by the time they went to college. What we have today are students who are not reading more and more difficult works by the time they get to high school. In fact, most of them aren't even reaching high school level reading levels by the time they get to high school, even though these standards promised to make everyone college ready. You asked what was the carrot. That was one of the carrots, that these standards were going to make all kids college ready. Well, that implies that somehow teachers were holding back and not
Right.
doing the teaching they should have been doing.
Which I don't
This is
buy.
unfair to teachers.
Right, absolutely.
They were trying hard with all kids, and to accuse teachers in general of holding back, of being bigots in some cases, is unfair. We didn't see that from our vantage point in the department. We weren't closing gaps because that wasn't the intent of MERA, M-E-R-A. Our intent, and this was a law written in 92, 93 by William Weld, Mark Roosevelt, and Tom Birmingham, if people remember the names and who these people were at that time. They were all prominent politically at that time.
I just saw Mr. Weld a couple days ago.
And
so,
they
yes.
could all speak the same language because they had all graduated from the Harvard Law School at
Yeah,
some
absolutely.
time.
Yep.
So they understood the problems with education and knew that there had to be accountability for each component in public education. And so they wrote what is still one of the best pieces of legislation nationally, MERA, that required accountability from schools by means of MCAS tests that would be administered at certain grade levels to all kids, and the standards were to be voluntarily adopted, and what you would then be able to see is whether students were being challenged to move ahead. Because the goal of MERA, the one that I was implementing, was that all kids had to do better. We were trying to raise everybody. The goal of ESEA, as it's been reauthorized since Bush II by Obama's administration and the current people in the USED, many of whom are holdovers from the Obama administration, their goal has been to close gaps, and that's a different direction. Once you close gaps instead of raising everybody, it's not clear exactly what you're doing in the classroom to close a gap.
Right. So, you're an expert in this field. What would you tell somebody who is a parent of a fourth grade child that you know is struggling, and they go to the schools and they say, hey, listen, I'm worried about it, but the school's only going to do, I mean, there are people who say that schools only teach the test now and that they don't do.
They spend a lot of time teaching to a test.
So what do you tell a parent who is desperate to look out best for their child, and they know that they're struggling and the school is...
That becomes a serious problem because the Common Core advocates don't want parents teaching math at home. They say that.
Well, they can't because the kids
It's
come
a
home
different
with
system.
different system and they don't know how to do it.
And so the parents are stymied. They don't know what to do unless they register their child for the Russian School of Math or hire tutors in some other way for their children. Now, it makes it very difficult. Parents can still control reading to a large extent because
Okay.
that is something they can arrange for at home. But if the school doesn't have a coherent curriculum whereby the teacher is challenging kids to move ahead with harder work, with more difficult texts, then it's up to the parent to do that. And that's not always very easy for a parent to do. Parents have to be more active in looking at what is happening in their schools. I was a parent of 5 children in the Brookline School, so I know what it's like to be an active parent questioning your own children. What did they do today? What did they learn today? What did the teacher do today? And parents no longer have the ability or the opportunity to go to their local principals or local administrators and ask for things to be different or for changes to be made because decisions have been removed from the local level. And this has been a part of the nationalization or centralization of education policy in Washington, USED, which is the part that I've also been criticizing and
But
fighting
you're a
against
strong
it.
proponent of local control of education.
I think we need strong local committees, and we need parents who can talk to their local principals
I couldn't agree
and
more.
teachers if they want to. They've got to be able to talk about what it is they don't understand or what their children are unhappy about or complaining about, and not just speak to someone who says there's nothing we can do about it because we're told this is what we have to do.
Now, you must talk to a lot of educators and a lot of teachers and a lot of
I
administrators.
have
mean,
over the years.
What are they
talked to
telling you?
Teachers are afraid to speak up. This has been a part of the problem. They're afraid to speak up because part of Race to the Top as a competitive grant to various states was to develop a system for evaluating teachers based on the idea that teachers were the problem. That was what our TTT was based on. And what teachers were to show was that students, particularly those who were low achievers, which is what my book is addressing, were doing better. Well, if teachers had been holding back, maybe the kids would be doing better. But it's hard to say that teachers were deliberately holding back in the past. No one wants to claim that. But somehow the thinking of bureaucrats in Washington and elsewhere, policymakers, was that the reason low achievers are low achievers is because no one is asking them or demanding that they do better. So and you hold the teacher accountable in terms of the teacher's evaluation, which is unfair to the teacher because most of them are trying to teach the kids that they have in front of them. And I used to be a supervisor when I was at Curry College in Milton, would go to the Trotter School, and I knew that the teachers were trying to teach whoever they had in their classes, so it was the principal making sure that kids were being taught. So you have a problem today in that there's an effort to make the teacher the fall guy when it is, and that's where teaching to the test comes from, because if the teacher's the fall guy, they're going to try to make the test scores as good as they can and spend a lot of time on teaching to the test, which is not good for the low achiever in particular.
No, I mean, nobody wins. We're talking to Dr. Sandra Stotsky on her new book, Changing the Course of Failure, which is coming out this May. We've only got a couple minutes left here on All Politics is Local. I wanted to talk a little bit, and we talked a little bit before the program started, a little bit about Bill Gates and his involvement with Common Core and how he got involved and kind of what you're thinking of why all of this money went into Common Core. I know we talked about closing the gaps and everything, but it doesn't seem to be working.
This is one of many, but perhaps the most well-heeled multi-billionaire we have in this country, with $64 billion to do as he wishes in his foundation. And he and his wife decided that they wanted to help nationalize public education based on their beliefs. There's nothing to back it up. Based on their beliefs that if Washington, D.C., USED, if the people at the USED were calling the shots, we would have low achievers becoming higher achievers. Nothing to back that up. But when you have $64 billion to spend and you want an image of yourself as a benevolent philanthropist, then and you give money to everybody, anything that moves, any organization that's around anywhere internationally, then you're going to find people supporting your position because they want more money coming. Everyone, every organization likes a little more money. So you have built-in corruption of the education process.
Boy, what a shame.
By someone who basically doesn't know much. I mean, this was not his area of expertise, education.
No.
He had no background in education, nor did his wife. And unfortunately, they chose a limited range of people who had no background in effective policy making in education. There isn't one who is known for having achieved anything that's effective in education policy. But when you have a lot of money to give away Annenberg tried this years ago. Some people may remember the amount of money that Walter Annenberg gave the schools. Evaluations have shown, and I've looked at them recently to see, that they accomplished nothing. So one of the questions, does money corrupt? When you give money to the schools and they want more money coming in, what do they do with it? We're not sure. But it doesn't affect the low achievers. It may, in fact, warp the educational process for low achievers. But no one wants to look at the damage that may have been done. All we can say is that since 1965, nothing has basically changed. On any education index that you can name, the same groups are at the bottom. Hispanics weren't looked at in 1965 because there weren't that many of them in the country. But over the years, as they were added, whatever groups are considered the low-performing groups stay as low-performing groups. And my book is pointing out that we possibly asked the wrong institutions. That's the point of part of my book. We've asked the wrong institutions to do something, our educational institutions, when we might have asked other institutions nationally, if we wanted to focus on this. For example, and I was looking at this today, Googling, we have the United States Maternal and Child Growth Bureau that deals with families.
Okay.
So before kids go off to school, and we know there are differences already before kids go off to school, maybe we need to start looking at other sources of failure or problems, why kids need help from kindergarten on.
Sure. I mean, it's a changing world. I think it's just common sense to me that we look at it. So we've only got about 30 seconds left here on All Politics is Local. Dr. Stotsky, tell us once again the name of your book and how people can find it starting in May.
You've got the whole title with the colon in the middle to show that it's got a lot of academic references in it.
Yes, it does. Changing the Course of Failure, How Schools and Parents Can Help Low-Achieving Students by Dr. Sandra Stotsky. Thank you so much for joining us here on All Politics is Local. We'll run all the contact information and blurbs about the book at the end of the program. Thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure. I'm John Featherston. Dr. Stotsky's book will be available in May. It'll be in hardback, paperback, and an ebook form, and it's published by Roman Publishing. And I'm John Featherston. Thanks for watching another edition of All Politics is Local, and we'll talk again real soon.